Bonjour, bonjour à toutes et à tous, et surtout à celles et ceux qui n'étaient pas là hier soir, donc qui découvrent cette assemblée. Je vous souhaite chaleureusement la bienvenue au Forum européen Where to Land, Embedding Performing Arts in a New Climate Regime. Et au nom de tous les partenaires de cette initiative, je suis heureuse de vous accueillir ici au Maillon, théâtre de Strasbourg, scène européenne.
Theatre European scene as the European center of creation, a center that is actively open to intercultural encounters. This forum is a step of work in a dynamic of emergency. During plenary sessions and thematic workshops, we will discuss the tools of responsible cultural production. We'll try to identify the axis of the reorganization of the cultural sector and draw up recommendations for public policies to support the actors of the performing arts in line with the current environmental challenges. It is quite recent that the cultural sector and especially the performing arts have begun to look into their ecological responsibilities. The initiative Where to Land is all the more significant. It shows the awareness of the inescapable transformations imposed by the climate crisis everywhere and in all fields. The scale of the catastrophe that we can see is undeniable. However, catastrophism would make us go round in circles and think in circles, or even to stop thinking at all. As it is showed by numerous political movements, often on our doorstep, we can show the state of the planet and that it requires us to think differently about the world and our place in it. We cannot just stop by making the observation the Earth is not going well. We have to go further. What is important here, what is important to us, is to debate, to build a place to debate, to define a political goal and a plan of action. The link between debate and action has to go through a method, has to be systemic, go through reflection on the artistical side, but also the political side. And this will allow us to work and activate levers at the European level and bring with it a deep transformation of the cultural sector. The ecosystem of the performing arts is complex, which is why this group here is carefully composed. You are artists, director of institutions, representatives of professional organizations and unions, funding bodies, and decision makers. And each of you will enrich this reflection with your viewpoints and your cultural contexts. We will also see arguments and debates. And again, I will quote Bruno Latour in his memoir, on the new ecological class that he wrote with Nikolai Schulz. He says, talking about nature is not signing a peace treaty. It is recognizing the multitude of conflicts about all possible subjects on all scales and in all continents. While we question our sector and how it works today, the ecological awareness is well and truly reflected in the work of many artists. You will discover the work of 5 representatives of a new cultural scene and a new ecological scene through graphic design, video, painting, film, and performance. This selection offers a panorama of the practices developed, but also the issues addressed. We will talk about the oceans and maritime traffic and the pollution that it generates. We'll talk about birds and how important the living is and living beings are, as well as sources and resources, energy sources, the water and the air. Please go ahead and take these debates further. Walk around here. look at the works by Capucine Weber, Abigail Babouche-Lévy, watch Jacques Loy's film, and follow the work of a fresca made by Philippe Baudeloc, as well as watch the film on the bay windows of Le Maillon. And finally, just like yesterday, let yourself be invited by the bad weeds and their special form of nature. Before giving the word to Hermann Lugan, I would like to thank him for conceptualizing and coordinating this forum, who was, until not too long ago, the director of the Bureau for Dance and Theater in Berlin, and who has really helped this project emerge. This project underwent a first phase of online debates and online dialogue between March and May 2022 with the support of the Aktionsnetzwerk Nachhaltigkeit and an expert organization in ecological consulting. With a steering committee and reinforced by the expertise of Camille Penn from the collective Les Augures, the forum Where to Land was able to take shape and come to its fruition in its physical shape today. So I would like to thank all those who have supported this project for months. The Syndeac, the Institut Goethe Deutschland, La Ville de Strasbourg, the City of Strasbourg, as well as all the public partners around the Cultural Support Fund and the triennial contract. The state, the region Grand Est, the European Collectivity of Alsace, and as well as the city and Eurometropolis of Strasbourg. I would like, of course, last but not least, to thank all the team of the Maillon Theatre and especially Joël Husser. I wish you all and I wish us productive discussions and a fruitful working day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here, for coming to join us from wherever you come in Europe. So I am Hermann Lugan, co-initiator of this initiative with the consortium of partners that was just named, whom I also thank. We have designed the program of this forum with these partners and the expertise of Camille Penn from the collective Les Augures, whom I would like to thank for her sharp and benevolent eye. I would like also to thank the entire Maillon team, each one of in his or her place, technical, communication, production, administration, is an essential player in the success of this forum. I would first like to introduce you a few key people who will accompany you during these 2 days. First, Joël Husser. Are you here, Joël? If you can. So, Joël, with whom you have all been in contact. She is your contact for all logistical and material questions related to the Maillon. She has done a considerable amount of production work. I would like to thank her very much for this. Camille Penn, maybe you can stand up, will answer all your questions about the program, the methodology, and the deliverable that we will produce at the end of this forum. Myself, for all other questions, I will also play the thankless role of timekeeper in order to ensure the group dynamics of our work. In this respect, if you would like, please feel free to switch off your mobile phones during these 2 days. Is that possible? And I would also like to introduce Noor Jedi and Lisa Wojciechowicz. They are our French and English interpreters in the cabin there. They will translate the session in this plenary room. During the workshops, the language of exchange will be English. For the French-speaking participants who are less at ease in English, Lisa and Noor will be able to come and support if the benevolence and support of the other participants of each group are not enough. The objectives of the forum. What is our goal? Where to Land, embedding European performing arts in the new climate regime, is an initiative launched about a year ago that aims to think and act out the necessary ecological revolution, I use the term revolution, within the performing arts in Europe. The aim is to define the way in which we can contribute for the art world and society in general to bringing about a model compatible with the future of life on Earth, on which our own survival depends. The aim of this 2 days forum is to formulate key commitments from the European performing arts sector as a whole and action plans to ensure the necessary transformation takes place quickly. This initiative was born in the summer of 2021, when our sector was emerging from the pandemic in a kind of thirst to make up for lost time, with the need to unclog the bottleneck of production put on hold during successive lockdowns. Even though for months we had been attending online professional discussions that tried to imagine a world after that would break away from the unbearable productivist and extractivist logics in which we felt we were stuck. Various exchanges with Nicolas Dubourg from Syndeac, Jakob Bilabel from the Aktionsnetzwerk Nachhaltigkeit, and Barbara Engelhardt from Le Maillon revealed a commonality of thought on the idea that our sector was missing out on something and that it was time to set ourselves in motion collectively. What distinguishes Where to Land and perhaps makes its approach original is a systemic, sectoral and European approach. Systemic. I will come back to this a little later. We propose to think beyond what each individual, each structure can do. Actions that we can call individual or technical. Until now, in a neoliberal logic, the responsibility of ecological redirection has been left mainly to individual actors. Public policies are often limited at best to incentive measures to the individuals. We are convinced that the sum of individual initiatives does not make a system. Given the scale of the ecological and climate challenge in particular, changes must be much more profound, systemic. We also have a sectoral approach. If we want to achieve systemic change, we need to involve all the players in the sector: artists, producers, programmers, institutions, funding bodies, policymakers. Otherwise, the risk is to put the bulk of the individual effort on the weakest link in the ecosystem, that of independent artists and producers. Substituting less carbon-intensive solutions for the transport of artists for air travel cannot be based solely on the injunction to artists to take the train. Institutions must play their part in taking into account and paying for longer travel times. The regulations must favor the least carbon-intensive transport solutions instead of decisions based on strictly economic criteria. And the additional costs of this regional mobility must be part of the dialogue between institutions and public partners, funding bodies. In March, we organized an online kick-off event attended by 400 European professionals, during which we tried to set up a dialogue between the different levels of the European performing arts system: artists, institutions, professional organizations, funding bodies, policymakers. It was particularly difficult to get the policymakers to sit around the table. We are the more grateful to those who are present with us during these 2 days. In the constitution of this assembly, we have been very careful to form a group that can represent the whole spectrum of the European performing arts ecosystem. And it's a European approach. This is the lesson of the regular online meetings we have organized since January. Many initiatives, expertise, and experiences of implementing individual actions and public policies exist in Europe. We have a lot to learn from each other. This European openness should also allow us not to reinvent the wheel where others have already been working for at least 15 years. In the end, it can save us time time which is one of the rarest resources we have in the face of an emergency. The European level also makes it possible to envisage the governance of the necessary ecological planning in articulation with the local, regional, and national levels of governance. This question of the articulation of ecological planning is central and will be the subject of a dedicated workshop. What are the highlights of these 2 days? How will our exchanges be organized? Around 4 key moments. We will have 3 keynote speeches to have a common vision of the state of the arts and the challenges. We will have collaborative work sessions to produce commitments and associated action plans together. And we will have feedback sessions to formalize and challenge the proposals and to spread the word beyond each of the individual working groups. And we will have convivial time during meals and artistic proposals to build community. Most of our time will be spent in subgroups, working on commitments and corresponding action plans. We will divide ourselves into the 10 working groups that we have set up. In forming the groups, we have taken into account the subjects with which you do not feel any affinity. Then we tried to form groups that both concentrated a form of expertise on the subjects addressed and were representative of diversity of perspective due to the geographical origin, but also to the place in the performing arts ecosystem of each of the participants. Within these groups, we are going to submit to you a formulation of the specific problem addressed and a series of commitments from the sector as a whole to achieve it. You should all have received this before this forum, but you will talk about this today. Today, we will work on these commitments, reformulate them, discuss them, rephrase them, and agree on them, hopefully. On this basis, we will work tomorrow on action plans to achieve this objective with particular attention to the systemic and political measures that we must implement. What will we do with your work? The deliverable. On the basis of your work and the analysis of the experts mobilized, a summary will be produced for the benefit of both the sector's stakeholders and policymakers at all levels of governance. This deliverable will be both a call to the sector to make a concrete commitment to the necessary ecological revolution and a plea to political decision makers to transform the regulatory framework and public policy to put us in a position to act. We believe that we will be all the stronger to plead our case if the sector shows its will and commitment to act. This deliverable will be disseminated widely, and its transformation into action will be therefore our collective responsibility. It is up to individuals to commit themselves at their level, for professional organizations and European networks to build their lobbying work on this basis, for policymakers to act with courage. The main principles behind the event. Finally, I would like to stress 3 points, 3 principles that should frame the debate. We will talk about the climate challenge. This is the focus of the forum. We are not exhausting the subject of the current ecological disaster here. There are 9 global limits as defined by an international group of researchers in 2009. Climate change is only one of them. In order to concentrate our expertise, we will limit ourselves to the climate issue. In ecological matters, everything ends up overlapping. The right thing to do for the climate is often right for biodiversity or the fight against ocean acidification. We will therefore keep the focus while being aware that we are not exhausting the complexity of the ecological issue. As a reminder, the 2015 Paris Agreement sets targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The European Union in the framework of the European Green Deal and the European Climate Law has translated them into its regulatory apparatus. The objective of carbon neutrality by 2050 and the intermediate objective of reducing emissions by 55% compared to 1990 levels by 2030 are therefore legally binding for us in Europe, in the European Union. These interim targets based on current emissions means an 80% reduction in emissions within 8 years. If there is one thing to remember from this introductory statement in the work of the next 2 days, it is this: the objective of reducing the emissions caused by our activity by 80% in 8 years. Second point, we need to focus on systemic responses. To reach this 80% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in 8 years, individual initiatives will not be enough. I already said it. It is the way in which the sector works, produces, disseminates works, collaborates, and envisages the mobility of professionals and audiences that must be fundamentally reviewed. We need to rethink the organization of the entire ecosystem. And for this to happen, the regulatory framework and public policies must be overhauled to accompany this profound change. To give an example, which I think is significant, the mobility of our audiences is one of the main, maybe the main source of greenhouse gas emissions in our sector. Individually, a theater can adapt its performance time to public transport times and try to make the transport offer evolve locally. It cannot do much more. On the other hand, the actors in the sector can decide to better coordinate their programming, to build coherent tours that allow the public to come and see a show in the theater of their town rather than going to see the same show in a distant capital. To do this, we must abandon the logic of exclusivity and the profiling of venues, but also the logic of influence and territorial attractiveness, the link between culture and tourism. It is clear that without the agreement of the public authorities that finance the said theaters, without the promotion of in-depth cooperative approaches rather than that of the competition that reigns today, there is little chance of seeing the necessary systemic changes take place. Finally, we must act in the spirit of climate justice. The principle of climate justice states that the efforts must be equitably distributed to counteract the injustices and unequal consequences of climate change. We draw the following reflections from this. First, as Europeans, we have a particular historical responsibility for the current disruptions, which primarily affect the global south. As such, it is first and foremost up to us, the privileged inhabitants of the global north, to define our commitments. On this basis, we will have everything to gain by opening up the dialogue with non-European perspective. In the manner, for example, the documenta in Kassel succeeded in doing in a dazzling manner. We will, second point about climate justice, we will also have to recognize in our exchanges that the context and realities within Europe itself are different and that they require an adaptation of responses and commitments without losing sight of the common climate objective. Finally, we need to articulate ecological and inclusion objectives. Too often in our discussions, we have heard in our exchanges that ecological commitments should be balanced against inclusion objective, which would risk being undermined by the new climate regime. I don't think so. I don't think we have to balance the ecological requirements against the requirement for inclusion. For too long, this perspective of balancing objective has been a factor of immobility on both fronts. This is, in my opinion, the weakness of the sustainable development perspective and its 17 objectives as defined by UNESCO in 1992. Today, we need to be ecological and inclusive. This means, in my opinion, that we must allow ourselves to set ambitious ecological goals and to think, when defining an action plan, about the conditions necessary for this transition to be made in a fair and inclusive way, without calling into question the ecological objectives. No. To conclude, between the time we started this initiative and today, the context has worsened, and in the exchanges we have had, it seems to me that measures that seemed very radical a year ago are now a minimum if we want to tackle the problem with any seriousness. And yet, we invite you to be optimistic, to cultivate the creative desire for change. Iphigenia Taxopoulou, whom we will hear from tomorrow morning, introduced me to the work of Georgios Kallis, his book Limits, Why Malthus Was Wrong and Why Environmentalists Should Care. Kallis reflects on the questions of limits by referring to the thought of Cornelius Castoriadis, for whom this question of limits must today be conceived less as a question of natural limits imposed on supposedly unlimited desires, he says there are no unlimited desires, than as an ethical questions of the limits that we set for ourselves. It is in this autonomy, this realization of freedom in the creative definition of our own limits, that the possibility of making ecological transformation desirable lies. This negotiation of limits is also the essence and sustenance of democracy. It implies and is the condition of possibility of the idea of climate justice, of the reduction of social, gender, and racial inequalities. In other words, the work we are doing here to define a sustainable model can fill us with both respect and enthusiasm for the space for invention and renewal that we can open up. And now the floor is given to Giada Calvano, together with Nadia Mirabella. So Giada, you can join me. Giada runs the consulting agency Choé Sustrainability. We commissioned Nadia and Giada to produce an interim report on our Where to Land initiative, a report that we have to send to you. In 30 minutes, she will remind us of the major challenges of ecological transformation in our sector, the difficulties we face, and point out the priority issues that we must work on. Samuel Valenzi from the Shift project will this afternoon take up this analysis, basing it on figures, analysis, and perspectives of the remarkable work carried out by the Shift project culture team, which he leads. But first, Giada.
Good morning, bonjour, hope you hear me well. First of all, I would like to thank all the organizers, so the Maillon for hosting us, Hermann, Camille, Joël, everyone, for this much needed European forum, and to all the participants coming from all parts of Europe. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here today in front of many of the persons and organizations that are committed to the fight against climate change in the cultural sector since many years, but also to all the people who just recently approached this world, but are willing to commit to take action in this sense. I am here today to open this two-day forum by sharing with you the preliminary results of the collective work carried out in the past month within the framework of the Where to Land initiative. But before presenting the first consideration emerged during the meeting and consultation, I would like to ask you some questions and to open a reflection. I suppose that if we are here today, it's because we all want a sustainable future for the planet, and in our specific case, taking action in the performing arts sector. So the question, of course, is not if we want a more sustainable future, but what kind of sustainability do we want for the performing arts sector, which could be rephrased as what are the changes that we are willing to adopt without compromising the essence of our work? Are we brave enough to commit to change through ambitious and radical solutions? In order to better explain the nature of this question, I would like to introduce you to the discourses of climate delay. Maybe many of you are already familiar with this concept, but some others don't. So let me better articulate this theory. Here we are not talking about climate deniers, who unfortunately still exist. And we have to keep fighting against their dangerous positions and beliefs. Here, in the discourses of climate delay, we are talking about all the people and organizations who do claim for a sustainable future, but they find excuses and arguments to delay this necessary transition. The scholars who mapped the discourses of climate delay identified 4 main typologies of recurrent arguments. First one, surrender, acknowledging that the mitigation of climate change is simply not possible because strong measures and initiatives would require such a radical transformation, and any actions we take are too little, too late, thus implying that mitigation is useless and suggesting that the only possible response is adaptation. Second group. The second group of discourse has to do with the issue of escaping responsibility by redirecting responsibility of climate action only, for example, on individual choices, or minimizing our sector footprint by comparing to others who do worse than us. You know, when we say the cultural sector is not such an impact compared to other industries. Or finding excuses for inaction, claiming that others may take advantage of our commitment to reduce emissions. This narrative concerns the real challenge of building a fair and comprehensive response to climate change. We should not wait for others to take the lead before considering action ourselves. Then we have the group of discourses which emphasize the downsides of climate action, implying that these carry an even greater burden for the society than the consequences of inaction. For instance, jeopardizing jobs and current living standards, and thus resulting in a highly conservative approach to climate policy making. Finally, we have the narratives that propose ineffective solutions to climate change by drawing attention away from more substantial and effective measures, like relying only on technological progress, or claiming that fossil fuels are part of the solution, or establishing narrow definition of success, with, for example, setting long-term targets that are not converted into real action, or again, pushing only for voluntary policies that expand consumers' choices, like, for example, it's okay to fund high-speed rail to substitute flights, but avoiding restrictive measures, for example, taxes or frequent flyer levy, whilst there is a need for both approaches under a strong climate policy. In saying so, I acknowledge that doing something is better than doing nothing, but we should be more ambitious than this. We should commit to radical change and thus propose radical solutions, even if these require effort and commitment, and sometimes imply a word that we tend to avoid, sacrifice. I would like to bear in mind these insidious discourses when we later debate in the workshop session. Let's go back to the provisional results emerged over this last year during the several meetings of the Where to Land initiative that involved more than 400 participants, as Hermann said before. For better understanding the issues at stake, we should first have a look at the wider and the sector-specific panorama of performing arts regarding the problem of climate change. We know that the fight against climate change has been on the international agenda for decades, but only recently, and also linked to the pandemic crisis, the urgency to tackle this issue experienced an acceleration. If we take a look at the current policy frameworks, also Hermann was introducing it a little bit before, there are general climate policy at different territorial levels, from the well-known Paris Agreement to the historical European climate law that claims for climate neutrality by 2050 for all member states, And at the national and subnational level, public bodies are required to adapt the Agenda 2030 requirements to their context and so propose viable national climate change adaptation plans. With regard to the cultural sector, the emergence of the importance of climate action is even more recent, even if many publications and resolutions linking to culture and development have been disseminated over the last year. For example, those produced by UNESCO, just to mention one. With the new European Union funding period, the one that goes from 2021 to 2027, the importance to advance in the ecological transition of all sectors, including the cultural and creative ones, has appeared more evident. For instance, there is the inclusion of some environmental requirement in the call for proposal of EU funding schemes, such as, for example, Creative Europe. Or there's been the creation of initiatives such as the new European Bauhaus or Perform Europe in the case of the performing arts sector. However, despite the reiterated claims stressing the crucial role of culture in sustainable development, we have to say that culture has been often neglected in the sustainability discourse. For instance, in the non-inclusion of a specific sustainable development goal dedicated to culture in the Agenda 2030. And in general, there is a need to transform this declaration and intentions into operational strategies and actions. Finally, the main discourses have focused more on the potential of creativity as a way to imagine and reinvent new scenarios to face the climate crisis, and less on assessing the ecological impact of the sector activities. But the need of assessing the effects of cultural operation on ecosystem has only recently emerged in the debates and is still largely ignored in cultural policies. If we look at the challenges that the cultural sector is facing in the climate crisis, we may notice first a general lack of governmental or industry mandate regarding the environmental transition of culture. For instance, legislation that may limit some practice which is negatively affecting the environment. Or a poor integration of environmental criteria and requirements in funding frameworks dedicated to cultural organizations and operators. Funding opportunities and incentives to foster the transition are to be set in place in order to boost the required change. The need to find common frameworks to measure sustainability impact for both the sake of commensurability of action and accountability of the sector. This is one of the greatest challenges, since we need to adopt these frameworks to different contexts and situations. There is also a need to create and share knowledge through networks and platforms, fostering intersectoral research, formal and informal education, and capacity building at all levels. Importantly, we must also work to overcome misconceptions, for instance, those related to the limited environmental impact of the sector, which is linked mainly to a lack of robust data. And I guess Samuel Valenci will show you some interesting data later on. And also, we have to overcome barriers to greening perceived by the cultural operators. For example, the lack of the resources, lack of specific technical expertise, lack of support from relevant stakeholders like public administration, or the high cost related to this ecological transition. Last but not least, we may generally talk about a lack of structured and articulated intervention of the sector as a whole on this topic. So systemic and disruptive changes are necessary to overcome these challenges. Given these premises, we try to collect and categorize the most relevant topics that emerged during the conversation within the Where to Land initiative framework, and we grouped under two main typologies. First group, cross-cutting topics. These are more general, conceptual reflections that build on a wider systemic understanding of the fight against climate change. And a second set of topics, categorized as operational topics, that are centered more on practical aspects and are defined by a set of operations that need to be implemented to favor the decarbonization of the sector. For both cases, we highlighted the strong point and the working points of each topic identified. Let's start with climate justice, which appeared as one of the most recurring topics throughout the conversation in the different meetings. There is a clear awareness of the importance of considering equity and fairness in the environmental transition and avoiding creating uneven structures. However, given the complexity of embracing such a transversal approach, contradictions may arise during practical implementation. For instance, when it comes to find a balance between environmental constraints, such as reducing touring, and the impact this may cause on artist wages. The challenge of embracing such heterogeneous and complex topics may make the scope of reflection too wide, increasing the risk of failure. Climate responsibility. Several participants expressed their availability and willingness to be held responsible for the action taken and to integrate this predisposition in their organizations. However, it is hard to define to what extent this commitment is translated into reality. Climate responsibility requires radical choices that maybe not all parties are ready to commit to. An important point regarding this topic is also the need to be held accountable not only of individuals, but also at the governmental and systemic level. The fight to climate change also requires a holistic approach, and for instance, many projects are already working through intersectoral collaboration at multi-territorial levels. Participants stress the importance to avoid working in silos and to establish common work frameworks at the different territorial and government levels. The importance of acknowledging differences between contexts have also been expressed. There is a wider discourse accounting for the singularities of different global geographical contexts, but also of different priorities that may be identified according to the different scales of action, being it European, national, regional, local, organizational, or individual, claiming for the need to integrate top-down and bottom-up perspectives. Accounting contextual specificity, however, may hinder comparability, making it difficult to replicate virtuous initiatives or evaluate activities in varied circumstances. The potential of creativity is considered one of the greatest leverages of cultural activity in climate action. In this sense, the role of artists and artist creation in spreading the sustainability message should be further researched and explored. Participants in the different meetings expressed the necessity to balance the environmental priorities with the nature and intrinsic characteristic of the performing arts sector, like, for instance, the importance of the live encounter and mobility, advising not to do less cultural work, but do it differently. For example, opting for longer stays when traveling for meetings or artistic residencies. Nevertheless, the fear of losing identity in the ecological transition may lead to rejecting or ignoring the required changes to be made. Sobriety. Sobriety has been identified as a key condition when thinking of possible solutions to tackle the climate crisis. We need to rethink business as usual, and this may mean, in some cases, abandon some current practices, like frenetic touring or massive festivals. Of course, downsizing current activities may encounter the reluctance of many agents. Thus, this transition should be supported in many ways, for instance, financially and through education. Now we look more at the operational topics, the operational level, at how to implement change in the practice. A first step to take is that of acknowledging the work already done by many organizations and individuals in this area through an exhaustive and extensive mapping of all the initiatives and projects happening around Europe. The importance of collaboration, partnership, and networking has been widely stressed out. Some collaborative initiatives already exist at the local and national level, but it could be advisable to join effort at the European level by creating European joint frameworks to further advance the fight against climate change from a sectoral perspective, in line with the recommendation of SDG 17. Another very relevant issue is that related to measuring the ecological and carbon footprint of the sector. Some entities that participated in the debates already have several years of expertise in this field and rely on a sufficient amount of data and results that can and should be capitalized. However, measurements are not a consolidated practice in the whole sector yet. Also, these are key to understand and set a baseline for appropriate management and future adaptation and reduction, and should be recognized as one of the starting points towards impact reduction. Setting legal frameworks is also perceived as a necessary condition to encourage virtuous ecological behavior and require an ongoing dialogue between policymakers and the different stakeholders involved. In this area, participants reminded that it is important to introduce binding conditions, but this should avoid inequalities and should be sustained by the different stakeholders. The potential of the performing arts sector to reach wide and varied segments of the population is seen as an opportunity to disseminate ecological messages and actively engage people in this transition. It has to be said that the relationship with the audiences and how this collaboration could lead to behavioral changes in daily life could and should be further explored. Supporting and accompanying performing arts organizations during this shift is fundamental, and this requires also to have people with adequate technical and sectoral background who may help this transition, especially in the first step, when specific scientific knowledge is required. Support should not be limited to financial aid like funding, but instead creating accompaniment or tutoring programs to foster this transition. As well, supporting programs should go hand in hand with education and training, address both to students and operators who are already working in this sector, of course, using different frameworks and starting from different premises. In this, it is crucial to identify the most relevant topics and tools to be included in curricula and courses, and that may help an effective ecological shift. Finally, research, both at the academic, the professional, and the artistic levels, is required, pushing for interdisciplinary exchanges of knowledge and practice, not only at the national, but again, also at the European level. So, based on the findings and reflection presented before, we prepared a preliminary list of recommendations that, of course, need to be further refined, and we are here today and tomorrow also to do so. First, an appropriate mapping of the past and ongoing projects, plans, strategy at the different European, national, local levels should be carried out in order to have an inventory of the actions already implemented, thus to frame the current state of the art. Along with the inventory, it is important to target the responsible players to be involved and categorize them according to the area of responsibility and influence. As previously mentioned, despite the existence of few networks at the national or local levels, a joint European platform to enable knowledge sharing and networking is still missing. And this may be created building on the expertise and recognition of already existing networks. Also, it is extremely important to estimate the magnitude of the impacts on climate change of the sector's operation by assessing its carbon footprint. And for this, an agreement on a common and coherent methodological framework is required. Such frameworks should not be invented from scratch, they already exist. That can be searched from the multiple existing technical methods. Once consensus on framework is reached, it is important then to define the tools to perform this measurement and to allocate and identify the appropriate human, material, economic resources necessary to apply it, especially for data collection efforts. The identification of the current state of the art and the evaluation of sectoral impacts will build the base for a coherent roadmap and reduction strategy, including targeted actions to decrease impact induced by identified main hotspots and drivers within a specific time frame. Technical support and expertise will be fundamental for performing a robust assessment and for accompanying performing arts organizations in this journey. The sector should also engage in an ongoing discussion between policymakers and representatives of institutions and organizations, ensuring an active role both in expressing needs and contributing with solutions. The possibility to introduce specific legal frameworks should not be perceived as just prohibition or bans. On the contrary, should be embraced with positive motivation and as a means for encouraging all operators to take more conscious and especially fast decisions. Adequate fiscal measures should be explored as well, from fiscal incentive for virtuous entities minimizing their impact on climate, to setting minimal environmental requirements to get access to funding. The sector has an incredible opportunity to build a climate strategy around its core assets, its creativity, and its power of imagination. In this sense, it is important again to stress the role of artists and artistic creation, and the possibility to involve audiences in a more active way, for instance, through climate ambassadors programs or other incentives for behavioral change. Tailored training may be envisaged according to the role played, being that of artists, that of producer, art director, technicians, students, etc. And according to specific themes and topics, for example, regulations, methodology for carbon footprint, or funding opportunities, etc. Finally, specific research programs may be defined involving cultural partners as well as institutions for higher education, research centers, and so on, that should promote an interdisciplinary approach and intervention of different professional profiles. Exploration and research on these topics may be funded at the European level through the presentation of project proposals in framework programs such as Horizon Europe, just to mention one. I hope this preliminary consideration could help as a base to start the debates of today and tomorrow. The expected result of these 2 days would be ideally to find an agreement about what kind of sustainable future we wish for the sector, and consequently propose a coherent action plan. For this reason, I ask you to be brave enough to be ambitious in your debates and proposals, and also to keep in mind that sustainability should be viewed as a process of becoming or constant improvement and not an end state. Thank you.